The helicopter touched down in a cloud of red dust, and another young American stepped into Vietnam. He had spent months in training. He knew how to fire his rifle, read a map, and follow orders. But none of that mattered to the men already waiting for him. The moment his boots hit the ground, he received a new identity: FNG, the fucking new guy. In Vietnam, that wasn't just a nickname. It was a warning. To the veterans of the platoon, an FNG wasn't simply inexperienced. He was unpredictable. A careless step, an unnecessary noise, or a moment of panic could reveal an entire patrol to an enemy that specialized in ambushes. Before a new arrival had even introduced himself, he carried a reputation he hadn't earned and suspicion he couldn't escape. Unlike previous American wars, soldiers in Vietnam usually didn't deploy with the men they had trained beside. The U.S. Army's individual rotation policy replaced personnel one by one instead of rotating entire units. Every week, helicopters delivered replacements into combat zones where everyone else already knew one another. The new soldier had to fit into a team that had survived together for months, often under relentless pressure. For the veterans, the arrival of an FNG stirred conflicting emotions. They remembered being new themselves, but experience had changed them. They had watched friends disappear into body bags after tiny mistakes. They had learned that survival depended as much on discipline as courage. Trust was no longer given freely, it had to be earned. Clinical psychologist Dr. Douglas R. Bay recognized this unique tension while studying combat stress during the war. His 1972 research identified the FNG as a major source of group anxiety. The newcomer wasn't simply adapting to combat, he was entering a social environment where every action affected the survival of everyone around him. The stress flowed in both directions. The new soldier feared making a fatal mistake, while the veterans feared that he actually would. For the FNG, the jungle itself seemed alive. Dense vegetation swallowed visibility. Heat wrapped around the body like a wet blanket. Every rustle of leaves demanded attention. Every narrow trail could conceal a tripwire or a carefully hidden explosive. Veterans moved quietly, scanning the ground almost instinctively. New arrivals struggled to understand what experienced soldiers seemed to notice without speaking. Simple habits became matters of life and death. A loose canteen could knock against equipment with enough noise to draw unwanted attention. A cigarette lit at night could be visible from hundreds of meters away. Even carelessly stepping onto the wrong patch of earth might trigger a hidden booby trap. None of these lessons were fully understood in classrooms back home. They were learned through observation and sometimes through tragedy. Because of this, many platoons watched their FNGs constantly. The scrutiny wasn't always personal. It was survival. Veterans often corrected newcomers sharply, sometimes harshly. Helmets were adjusted, equipment was tied down, patrol formations were explained again and again. To an outsider, it could look like bullying. But beneath the rough language was a desperate effort to prevent avoidable mistakes before they cost lives. The pressure weighed heavily on the newcomers. Many later recalled saying very little during their first weeks. They listened more than they spoke. They copied how veterans packed their gear, where they walked, when they paused, even how they scanned the jungle. Every patrol became an examination. Every successful day meant they had survived another test. The irony was impossible to ignore. The men least trusted were often those facing combat for the very first time. They had volunteered or been drafted to serve their country, yet they entered a brotherhood that could not afford blind faith. Respect wasn't awarded because of rank or good intentions. It was earned through shared danger, one patrol at a time. Adding to the uncertainty were reports surrounding the early reliability problems of the M16 rifle. During the war's early years, documented issues with ammunition, maintenance guidance, and equipment contributed to serious concerns among American troops. Congressional investigations later examined these failures, and for many soldiers arriving in Vietnam, confidence in their weapon became another source of anxiety in an environment where certainty was already in short supply. For every helicopter that landed with fresh faces, another carried away men whose 12 months were nearly complete. Somewhere in between stood the FNG caught between innocence and experience, trying to survive long enough to stop being the new guy. But in Vietnam, surviving wasn't only about defeating the enemy. First, you had to convince your own platoon that they could trust you. For most FNGs, the first patrol was the moment training ended and reality began. Long before sunrise, the platoon quietly prepared to leave its firebase. There were no dramatic speeches or heroic moments. Men checked each other's equipment in silence, tightened bootlaces, and made sure every buckle and canteen was secured against unwanted noise. The veterans barely spoke. They had followed this routine countless times, knowing that the jungle rewarded discipline and punished carelessness. The new man watched everything. He noticed how experienced soldiers instinctively spread out instead of walking close together. He saw them avoid obvious paths, scan the trees before stepping into clearings, and communicate with subtle hand signals instead of voices. Every movement seemed deliberate. Every habit had been written in experience, often at a terrible cost. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army understood the terrain better than almost anyone they faced. Rather than seeking large conventional battles, they frequently relied on ambushes, concealed fighting positions, and elaborate systems of booby traps. A bamboo stake pit, a tripwire connected to a grenade, or a carefully camouflaged explosive could stop an entire patrol within seconds. That knowledge weighed heavily on every newcomer. Veterans often placed the FNG somewhere in the middle of the patrol formation. It wasn't necessarily an insult, it was protection. The point man required exceptional observation skills, while the rear guard needed equal experience. Until a replacement proved he could read the jungle and remain calm under pressure, others carried the most dangerous positions. Still, mistakes happened. Sometimes an FNG forgot to maintain proper spacing. Sometimes he hesitated after hearing an unfamiliar sound. Sometimes curiosity caused him to reach toward an object that every veteran knew should never be touched. These errors rarely came from carelessness. They came from inexperience in an environment unlike anything American training bases could truly replicate. Experienced soldiers corrected these mistakes immediately, often with language as sharp as the danger surrounding them. To outsiders, the exchanges could sound cruel. To those living through them, every harsh word carried the same message: stay alive and keep the rest of us alive too. Military historian DePue has argued that the individual rotation policy created a constant imbalance inside American units. Just as one soldier became experienced enough to contribute fully, his 12-month tour was nearing its end. At the same time, another inexperienced replacement would arrive to begin the process again. Instead of building long-term cohesion, many platoons spent the entire war integrating newcomers while preparing to lose seasoned veterans. This revolving door shaped relationships in subtle ways. Veterans nearing the end of their tours often became known as short-timers. Many counted the days until they could leave Vietnam, marking calendars, helmets, or personal equipment to remind themselves how close they were to going home. Every unnecessary risk seemed harder to justify when survival for another few weeks meant seeing family again. For the FNG, however, the calendar stretched endlessly ahead. He knew he had nearly an entire year remaining. While experienced soldiers measured time by days left, the newcomer measured it by days survived. The psychological gap between the two could be enormous. Trust came slowly, often through moments that never appeared in official reports. A veteran might quietly hand an FNG extra water during a long patrol. Someone would offer advice about keeping feet dry during the monsoon season, or explain how to recognize the nearly invisible signs of disturbed ground that could indicate a hidden trap. These small acts carried enormous meaning. They signaled that the newcomer was beginning to be accepted. Then came the moment every FNG feared: the first firefight. Veterans later described how memory seemed to slow during those terrifying seconds. The crack of rifle fire echoed through the trees. Machine guns roared, men instinctively dropped behind whatever cover they could find as shouted commands mixed with explosions and flying debris. For the FNG, panic was the greatest enemy. Some froze, others reacted exactly as they had been trained. Those who listened carefully, stayed with their squad, and controlled their fear often earned something more valuable than praise. They earned confidence. Combat stripped away assumptions. No one cared where a man came from, what his civilian job had been, or how confident he sounded back home. Under fire, only actions mattered. The newcomer who stayed steady while bullets snapped through the jungle quickly became more than an FNG. He became someone the platoon could rely on. Veterans remembered those moments for decades, not because they transformed ordinary soldiers into heroes overnight, but because they marked the beginning of belonging. The labels that had separated old hands from new replacements gradually lost their importance. In Vietnam, acceptance was never given by words alone. It was earned one patrol, one decision, and sometimes one firefight at a time. As the weeks passed, something almost invisible began to change. The young replacement who had stepped off the helicopter with nervous eyes and unfamiliar equipment no longer needed to watch every move the veterans made. His own movements had become quieter, more deliberate. He could recognize the subtle signs of danger that had once escaped him. He knew how to move through elephant grass without exposing the patrol, how to react when the jungle suddenly fell silent, and how to read the expressions of the men around him without a single word being spoken. Without realizing it, the FNG was becoming one of the veterans. It was a transformation measured not by rank or medals, but by survival. George Cornell's research into Vietnam-era military slang captured how deeply the term FNG became woven into the culture of American units. It was more than crude humor. It identified someone standing at the beginning of a journey every combat soldier remembered all too well. The label eventually disappeared, but only after weeks or months of proving that you could carry your share of the burden. Even then, there was no guarantee the burden would ever become lighter. Many veterans later described living in a constant state of alertness. Every patrol demanded absolute concentration. Every village had to be approached carefully. Every stretch of jungle carried the possibility of an ambush or an unseen explosive. Sleep came in short, uneasy periods, interrupted by guard duty, incoming mortar rounds, or the simple expectation that something could happen before dawn. Psychologists studying the war recognized that this relentless pressure affected not only individuals but entire groups. The platoon became its own survival system. Every man's actions influenced everyone else's chances of making it home. When one soldier grew careless, the entire group became vulnerable. When one soldier demonstrated calm judgment under pressure, confidence spread through the patrol. That shared dependence created unusually strong bonds. Veterans often remembered the friendships formed in Vietnam as unlike any they experienced elsewhere in life. These relationships were built under extraordinary circumstances, where trust developed through shared hardship rather than conversation. A man who had once been viewed with suspicion could eventually become the person another soldier trusted most. Yet just as that trust reached its strongest point, the system interrupted it. The individual rotation policy meant that experienced soldiers completed their 12-month tours one by one. They boarded helicopters and transport aircraft bound for home while the platoon remained in the field. Almost immediately, another unfamiliar face arrived carrying a fresh duffel bag, newly issued equipment, and the uncertainty every veteran recognized. The cycle began again. The experienced soldier, who had once been an anxious FNG, now found himself studying the newest arrival with the same cautious eyes that had once been fixed upon him. He checked the newcomer's gear, corrected his mistakes, wondered whether the young replacement would stay calm when the shooting started. History repeated itself not because anyone wanted it to, but because the rotation system demanded it. Many historians have argued that this constant turnover prevented American combat units from achieving the long-term cohesion seen in armies that trained, deployed, and returned home together. Instead, Vietnam created platoons that were always changing, always absorbing new men while saying goodbye to seasoned ones. Experience accumulated slowly and disappeared just as quickly. For the individual soldier, the emotional cost often became fully apparent only after the war ended. Years later, veterans continued discussing what it meant to be an FNG. In reunions, memoirs, interviews, and veteran communities, many described those first terrifying weeks more vividly than almost any other period of their service. They remembered the fear of making a fatal mistake, the embarrassment of not knowing the unwritten rules, and the immense relief when someone finally treated them as part of the team, rather than the new replacement. Those memories echo through veteran discussion groups even today. Men from units such as the 4th Infantry Division, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, The 1st Cavalry Division and many others continue to compare experiences that, despite taking place in different provinces and different years, often sound remarkably similar. Different units, different battles, the same emotional journey. The story of the FNG reveals something larger than military slang. It exposes the human consequences of a war fought under a unique personnel system, where strangers were expected to trust one another almost instantly in one of the world's most dangerous environments. It shows how fear could coexist with courage, how suspicion could eventually become loyalty, and how survival depended as much on relationships as on weapons or tactics. For the men who lived through Vietnam, becoming an FNG was never a rite of passage anyone wanted. But almost every American who served there began the same way. Stepping off a helicopter into unfamiliar heat, carrying a rifle, searching the faces of strangers, and wondering whether they would live long enough to stop being the new guy. For many of those veterans, decades have passed since they left Vietnam. Yet the 3 letters FNG still carry the weight of fear, uncertainty, hard-earned trust, and the unforgettable moment when war ceased to be an idea and became their daily reality.